What if I told you that in the heart of the 19th century, thousands of people in London paid a single penny not for a bed, not even for a chair, but just for the right to sit upright all night long, tied to a rope so they wouldn't collapse from exhaustion? Imagine children as young as 6 crawling through coal mines in total darkness, their lungs blackened before they ever learned to read, or women swallowing miracle medicine filled with morphine and arsenic, smiling as they slowly poisoned themselves. This was not a nightmare or a dystopian novel. It was daily life for millions of ordinary people less than 200 years ago. These stories are rarely told in history books, yet they shaped the world we live in today. Stay with me until the end, because each detail will make you question how humanity ever survived the 19th century at all. And if you love uncovering the hidden truths of everyday life in the past, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it. Your support gives me the motivation to keep bringing you these forgotten chapters of history. Imagine walking into a boarding house in New York during the mid-19th century. The air is heavy, carrying the smell of coal smoke, sweat, and boiled cabbage. You open a door, and inside you don't find a cozy bedroom but a space barely larger than a closet. A straw mattress, a single chair if you're lucky, and walls so thin you can hear every cough, every argument, every whispered prayer from the rooms around you. This was not unusual. It was the standard way of life for millions of working-class men and women. What shocks me the most is how people accepted it. Privacy, something we treat as a basic right today, was once a luxury reserved only for the wealthy. In some houses, dozens of tenants squeezed into a single building. One 4-story boarding house in Manhattan reportedly held more than 70 souls, all living shoulder to shoulder. There was no space for secrets, a fight with your spouse, a child crying at midnight, even the sound of a man's final breath. These became part of your neighbors' lives too. And the truth is, these houses weren't just shelter. They were a mirror of society. By night, the same room rented to a poor immigrant could be handed to a prostitute or a gambler looking for a place to hide. Some landlords rented beds in shifts. One worker slept by day, another by night, the sheets still warm when you laid down. I try to picture myself in that world, and honestly, it feels suffocating. No locked door, no quiet space to think, just a constant reminder that survival meant giving up the comfort of solitude. It makes me wonder, would we have been strong enough to live like that? Or have we grown so used to privacy that we forget how fragile it really is? The boarding house wasn't just about cheap rent. It was about stripping life down to its bare bones. Food, sleep, work, repeat. And as we leave those suffocating rooms behind, let's step into another dark corner of the 19th century, a place where even childhood itself was stolen away in the name of labor. Now, if the boarding house stripped away privacy, the factories and mines of the Industrial Revolution stripped away something even more precious: childhood itself. Picture a boy of 6 years old, his face blackened with coal dust, crouching in a tunnel so small even adults couldn't fit. His job? To sit in silence for 14 hours, opening and closing a wooden door so carts of coal could pass. They called him a trapper. Imagine the darkness, broken only by the squeal of iron wheels and the occasional flicker of a candle. No toys, no sunshine, just endless hours of waiting. It wasn't just boys. Girls as young as 8 worked in textile mills, fingers nimble enough to tie broken threads while giant machines roared around them. One slip, one strand caught in the wrong place, and their hair, or worse, their hands, were pulled into the gears. Newspapers at the time recorded children scalped, maimed, or crushed. I can't help but think of how terrifying it must have been for them, standing so small beneath those towering machines. What shocks me most is how normal it all seemed back then. Families were so desperate that sending a child to the mill was considered survival, not cruelty. I imagine the parents must have told themselves, at least he has work. At least she's bringing home pennies for bread. But deep down, how could it not break their hearts? If you've ever watched a child laugh freely, you know how sacred that innocence is, and yet for millions of children in the 19th century, laughter was a rare luxury. Sometimes I wonder what kind of adults those children became. Did they ever forgive the world that stole their youth? Or did they simply harden, carrying their scars silently? It makes me realize how lucky we are today. When childhood is seen as something to be protected, not exploited. But as grim as that sounds, this wasn't the only way poverty twisted life in the 19th century. For the homeless, even the act of sleeping came with a price, and what they paid for was almost unimaginable. If child labor stole away innocence, homelessness in the 19th century stole away even the dignity of sleep. Imagine being so poor that you couldn't even afford to lie down. In London's darkest corners, the homeless turned to something called the penny sit-up. For a single coin, you could sit on a wooden bench all night, your body tied forward against a rope so you wouldn't fall to the floor when exhaustion hit. No bed, no blanket, just a long, sleepless vigil with dozens of strangers swaying in the dim light. The sound of coughs, groans, and weary breaths must have echoed like a funeral hymn until morning. And then there were the coffin houses. For a few pennies more, you were granted a wooden box barely wider than your shoulders, lined up beside dozens of others. Men and women crawled into those crates and closed their eyes, trying to pretend it was rest. To us, the image is disturbing, a room full of living corpses laid in rows, but for the poor, this was considered a mercy. A coffin was better than the cold pavement. When I first read about these places, I had to stop and think, what does it say about a society where people literally had to pay just to exist for the night? I imagine walking past one of those shelters, hearing the muffled sounds of life inside, and wondering how many dreams were crushed under the weight of that rope. How many hopes lay boxed in those wooden coffins? It's haunting, isn't it? Because it reminds us that survival often meant sacrificing humanity. And yet, as grim as that sounds, the danger didn't always come from poverty alone. Sometimes, it came from the very things people trusted to keep them alive, their food and medicine. That brings us to another unsettling truth of the 19th century, one that strikes closer to home than you might expect. We like to believe that medicine is meant to heal us, but in the 19th century, the cure was often worse than the disease. Imagine a worried mother in 1870, cradling her restless baby. She reaches for a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, a best-selling remedy proudly advertised as safe for children. What she doesn't know is that each teaspoon is laced with morphine. Her child grows calm, finally drifts to sleep, and sometimes never wakes up again. And it wasn't just children. Ordinary people filled their cabinets with brightly labeled patent medicines that promised to fix everything from headaches to melancholy. Behind the fancy names, a cocktail of alcohol, cocaine, and even arsenic. People drank poison every day, thinking they were protecting their health. I can't help but picture a tired factory worker, stumbling home after a 14-hour shift, pouring himself a tonic that left him more addicted than relieved. Even fashion carried danger. Dresses dyed a brilliant emerald green were made with arsenic pigment. Women wore them proudly at parties, never realizing the color slowly seeped into their skin, causing rashes, hair loss, and sometimes death. The same poison was used in wallpaper, so a family could unknowingly decorate their home with their own executioner. One chilling case in Bradford, England, in 1858 saw more than 200 people poisoned when arsenic was accidentally mixed into candy. 20 died from what should have been a sweet treat. Reading these stories, I can't help but feel grateful for the safety standards we almost take for granted today. But it also makes me wonder, how many things in our own lives do we trust blindly, without realizing the risks? The 19th century reminds us that danger often hides in plain sight. And if that seems shocking, wait until you hear what people back then considered entertainment. From freak shows to body snatchers. The next chapter of this story is perhaps the most disturbing of all. After hearing about deadly medicines, you might think nothing could be more disturbing. But for the poor of the 19th century, even entertainment was soaked in darkness. Imagine walking into a crowded tent at a traveling fair. The banner outside promises wonders: the bearded lady, the human skeleton, the elephant man. Inside, people with rare conditions were displayed like living curiosities. Families paid their last coins to gawk, to laugh, to whisper. I try to imagine how those performers felt. Were they proud to earn a living? Or quietly broken, knowing their bodies were the ticket? And then there were the body snatchers. Doctors needed cadavers for medical schools, but the law provided far too few. So gangs crept into graveyards by night, prying open coffins, dragging out the newly dead, and selling them to universities. Families would sit guard by fresh graves, sometimes sleeping beside their loved ones, terrified that by morning the body might be gone. Can you picture that? Mourning a father or child while keeping watch like a soldier in the night? To me, that image is one of the most haunting in all of history. But perhaps the most popular spectacle of all was public execution. In London, crowds of tens of thousands gathered in the streets to watch men hang. Children sat on shoulders, vendors sold pies, and people cheered as the condemned drew their final breath. It was treated like a festival. I can't help but shiver at that thought. That death was once a form of mass entertainment. A shared experience families looked forward to. Looking back, it's easy to judge, but maybe the truth is simpler. For the poor, life in the 19th century was so harsh that pain and death became familiar companions. Watching another's suffering was a reminder that, at least for today, it wasn't your own. And that, I think, is the most sobering lesson of all. That survival can twist not just how we live, but even how we find joy.